balance between the world's energy needs and the environmental concerns of global warming have now, more than ever, been a pressing concern that demands immediate attention. Governments from around the world are beginning to put into place aggressive goals to make sure we're not too late to change a potentially bleak future for our children and their children's children. With carbon taxes and regulations, we need to find new, better, and more efficient ways of attaining our energy needs to maintain and improve our quality of life, and it's been left up to the energy-producing corporations to find ways to do this. My guest today as Senior Vice President of Planning, External Relations, and Chief Sustainability Officer, Kate Chisholm from Capital Power, is here today to tell us about not just the awesome technologies that are being worked on to achieve all this, but also how they are right on track to make sure and meet their environmental, social, and governance goals. Kate, thank you so much for coming and joining us today and chatting with us about all the great things that Capital Power is doing, some of these future goals and ambitions that you guys are working toward and getting there a lot faster than I think you guys even thought you were going to get there. And so it just goes to show some of the really good work that you guys are doing. So maybe first off, maybe just tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got into Capital Power and how long you've been in energy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, first of all.
Absolutely.
This is super fun. But I have been at Capital Power since it was IPO'd from EPCOR Utilities in 2009. I am Capital Power's mother. I'm very old. So I've been in the energy industry since probably about 1987. And I love it. I have devoted my life to environmental law first, and now as Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer at Capital Power, I get to do what just really floats my boat and sort of help the company help others.
That's awesome. Right on. Some of the things you guys are doing over there is phenomenal. We'll jump right into some of the more environmental things because that's been such a hot topic over the last few years. Well, for quite some time, but I think more prevalent in the last few years as governments start to take more action, make bigger announcements about the changes they want to make within their own countries. And let's just talk about Capital Power's role in that portion when it comes to environmental. You guys got some really great technology that you guys have been developing and some amazing initiatives that you're doing with some pretty, I wouldn't say ambitious goals. I mean, they're basically mandatory goals now based off of how governments are reacting. Can you tell us a little bit about some of that stuff?
Well, Capital Power has been working on climate change for a very long time. And we should, for the record, say that Alberta was the very first province in Canada to have a carbon tax.
Yes.
So we've been paying the carbon tax and measuring our emissions since about 2007. And since then, we've been thinking about climate change and how to reduce the carbon emissions from our operations through carbon capture, usage, and storage. And so we've had a number of projects, all of which ended up being completely technically viable, but very expensive. So just couldn't compete with the other electricity producers around us. And so they were all sort of put on the shelf until we have a pretty significant and growing carbon tax. And all of a sudden, now they're becoming quite competitive. And so we get to dust them off. And we believe in a lot of sort of future technologies. In the road to decarbonize a completely net carbon neutral 2050, we're going to need an all of the above approach. So we're going to be looking at a whole bunch of uber cool kind of Jetsons kind of stuff. But we've sort of thought it out pretty carefully, I think, and we've constructed a pathway to 2050. And the first hurdle we have to jump is 2030. Yeah. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN's body, and the International Environment Agency and every other expert in the world says that we will not make our 2050 goals unless we make our 2030 goals. So priority one is making that 2030 goal.
You bet.
And 2030 is only 8 years away.
Coming fast.
So, and this is going to require infrastructure. So we need to design, permit, build big machines in order to do this, and that can take a while. So we're focused on reducing the emissions from our current fleet, and we're going to do that, for example, at Genesee, which is just right outside Edmonton.
You bet.
First of all, that complex was a huge coal complex. And what we're doing is there are 3 big generating units there, and one of them is just going to burn gas in the coal unit. But the other 2 we are repowering, and what that means is removing the guts of them and putting in new super high-powered generators that will be hydrogen ready, 30% hydrogen ready when they're installed.
Yeah.
We won't have a source for that just yet, but they will be hydrogen ready. And then after we've done that, and I should say just doing that will reduce their emissions by half, because natural gas doesn't emit as much as coal, obviously.
Right.
And then we're going to attach a CCUS unit to them that will take them down to almost 0 emissions. And we hope to have the repowering done by 2023 and the CCUS units in the ground and sequestering carbon by 2026, maybe 2027.
Yeah.
And
And this is ahead of your goals.
this is ahead of anybody's goals.
Of anybody's goals.
We, Capital Power was required to shut down its coal by 2030, and we're going to be doing it by 2023. We've already begun, right?
Yeah.
And then that 3rd unit that we're just going to be running natural gas in, we're going to attach something to it what's called the Genesee Carbon Conversion Center, and it's going to capture carbon out of our flue gas, and it's going to convert that carbon into carbon nanotubes. Now, carbon nanotubes look like little black cake sprinkles, but they're stronger than steel, more conductive than copper, and lighter than aluminum. Yeah. So there's lots of industrial uses for them, and we're hoping that we will be able to convince some people downstream from us to incorporate them into things like aluminum, steel, cement, even rubber tires, to reduce the emissions that are created in those downstream industries. We now have a partnership with Lehigh Cement, which is one of the 2 largest cement manufacturers in the world, and we're experimenting with all of their forms of cement. But we believe that if we can get them to use the carbon nanotubes for certain applications of their cement, they will only have to produce 2/3 of what they would ordinarily have to produce, which will obviously reduce their emissions by 1/3 when they do that.
Yeah.
So we're not only capturing our own emissions, we're hoping to help downstream players as well.
I love it. Turning a problem into a multiple avenue solution for different industries. That's really cool. Some of the other cool things, so you talked on nanotubes, you've talked on this carbon capture. Some of your guys' goals was to have the credits, have your carbon capture credits nice and high and healthy. You're doing some other really cool things in regards to inclusion and diversifying with your women's involvement in leadership roles. That's a super awesome thing. Can you tell me a little bit about how you guys are doing that from a management standpoint?
Absolutely. So we've been working on equity, diversity, and inclusion for some time. And of course, we have corporate offices and we have plants all over North America. Corporate offices aren't really a problem because you can always recruit lots of diverse people into your corporate offices. Yeah. But the plants have been typically very male-dominated and Caucasian-dominated. And so we've got several different programs that we've been working on for a long time, and they weren't making a difference as fast as we wanted. So what we've done, we started last year and this year, everybody in leadership at Capital Power, their bonuses are going to be partly contingent on making our EDI goals. Wow. And so we're hoping that by putting our money where our mouths are, we will be able to create change faster.
That's a fantastic initiative for you guys as the governing body for Capital Power to take that on, and I love it. Put your money where your mouth is. So that kind of leads me right into where we wanted to go, which is ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And we've talked a little bit about the environmental, all the things you guys are doing there. There's so much more we could jump into because you guys have like your capture and storage program with your wind farms. You've got some solar initiatives. So much we can go down to, but I think we'll let people go and and do their homework and learn a little bit more about that on your guys' website and stuff. But let's get into the ESG, because when people are looking into this economy, especially right now, people are always looking for investments. They're looking to where do they put their money, and they want to put their money into something that is holds true to their values. And that's where this ESG comes into. And the more and more we start looking at corporations across the board, this is becoming a very, very common term. It's starting to get more traction. It's starting to be more and more important. And it's not just about the bottom line, but it's about what a company's sustainability and future is for everybody, not just itself. Let's talk a little bit, or tell me a little bit about how you guys are incorporating ESG and how that's been working out for you guys.
So I think you can look at ESG or sustainability in three ways. One is it's just corporations doing the right thing, which is true.
Yeah.
Another is, I think, as you've said, you've touched on, it's sort of risk management. Because if you look at all of the major corporate disasters over the last 25 years, and I'm including Volkswagen Dieselgate, BP Deepwater Horizon, there have been a number of major ethics failures in insurance companies and banks and so on. Those are all sustainability failures. And so a lot of people look at sustainability or ESG work as just risk management. Because those are company killers. And the reason they're company killers is because if BP's stock price dove 2 days after Deepwater Horizon, and for good reason, it should have.
Yeah.
But the social media now carries those things to a point where you really can't mitigate them. You can't manage them once they're out there.
Yes.
And so what you need to do is avoid having bad things happen. And this is what ESG is, right?
Yeah.
And then, as you said, also, it allows employees, customers, investors, everybody to be spending their money, investing their money in things that accord with their own personal values. And so that's all really, really important. That's why I love my job. So what are we doing? Well, E and S have sort of converged a little bit in, especially in COVID. But
Right.
so there's a lot of social factors that affect how fast we can go on environment. And so, for example, the government's policies need to balance the cost to consumers against the speed with which we go. And what I mean by that is we should be, for example, removing emissions as fast as we possibly can and as fast as our current technology will allow us.
Yeah.
But if the carbon tax, for example, goes above $200 or something like that, and it outpaces what technology can do, that's just putting people out of business, and it's just adding to consumer bills and so on and so forth. So the government is playing this sort of balancing act, right? And the other thing is, an example would be everybody in COVID is now looking at their supply chains. We should have been looking at supply chains a lot more carefully before COVID, and many of us were, but we were looking at it from a carbon footprint perspective. Now we're looking at it from the perspective of other potential dangers to it, like pandemics and border adjustments and things like that. And so all of those things and their impacts on the consumer and the voter are sort of beginning to tie together. It's pretty complex. The other thing is, and you and I have talked about this before, there are a lot of people out there who are very, very well-meaning, who would really like for us to get off fossil fuels completely, like that. But of course we can't, because you can't build a wind turbine or a solar panel or an electric vehicle without petrochemicals, without fossil fuel.
Yeah.
And we're certainly not going to get to our 2030 climate goal without fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is, in my industry, we need to sort of proliferate wind and solar and other renewables as much as we possibly can, but they are very volatile sources of electricity. The wind gusts, and so the electricity that comes from the wind also gusts. And what you need is somebody or something that can sort of smooth the supply to accommodate that.
Yeah.
And at the moment, the only technology that will do that is natural gas.
Right.
So we have to decarbonize it. We have no choice as a society. We have to decarbonize it. And this is where Capital Power and, I should say, virtually every other energy company in Alberta has been focusing its efforts.
Yeah. Becoming more efficient is what the goal is. And then with all that stuff comes the development of the new technologies that gets us to the next best thing and the next best thing and the next best thing. And I mean, we see it in our consumer electronics. You know, the day the newest iPhone comes out or fancy dancy computer, it just speeds up the process for us to get to the next best thing. So staying diligent and consistent with developing and looking outwards to new ways of doing things is super, super important. But where, like you said, it's going to be pretty close to impossible to just get off of petroleum products and petroleum manufacturing, because it's in everything. It's in our fabrics. It's in our plastics. We talked a little bit off camera about just the need for plastics when it comes to transporting food. You wouldn't have the food that we'd have in our home if it wasn't for plastics to preserve it. I want to go back. I love that you explained that balance between how fast we move to cost, because the faster we move, we need more money to make that happen. But if we can't afford it, it's got to be that balance. And I've never really looked at it that way. And that's a great way of explaining it. So thank you for educating me on, on something I've never taken it from that perspective. Now, with the government's push and with everything that you guys are doing, the whole world needs to we all got to get on the same train here. Like, the whole world needs to be moving in the same direction. We can't have one guy talking, a different language than the other when it comes to this matter and environmental change. What are some of the things when it comes to policy and just communication of these things that you guys are doing and the collaborations that can be worked on or should maybe be explored? Are there things that Capital Power is doing to entice those kinds of conversations and activities?
Well, I go all over North America, talking to people like you that will actually listen. And I'm hoping that more and more people are listening. And I'm not alone on that. There are an army of us from the energy industry. We need to understand that people that work in the energy industry are avid, ardent climate change believers. We are working as hard as we can in earnest on climate change. We all have children and grandchildren. We've been a little bit demonized, I think, by the media, but we're all working really, really hard on that. And we're working together because, we've seen with agencies like COSIA, and we collaborate with our competitors, not just in Alberta, but all over North America, because we believe that fighting climate change is going to benefit everybody. This is not sort of a competitive matter. And so when you ask what are we doing, we're doing everything we can think of. And we're hoping that people like you will help us touch audiences who aren't in the choir, because we need to sort of have this conversation with people who haven't yet thought about these things.
Right. We see it in Alberta's rebound right now, coming out of the pandemic. We see it in the economic rebound. Energy companies reinvesting in renewable resources and in other technologies to kind of work against themselves, but they understand that they know, like you just said, you guys understand, like, it's about sustainability. The world needs to be here when we're long gone. And if we don't start acting now, it's not going to be. So it's something that's you're right, everybody needs to get on board with, and we're seeing it. We are seeing it. It might be a little bit behind the curtain, or it might be a little bit hidden because the technology doesn't speak directly to oil and gas, even though it's coming from oil and gas. Look at the technology that's been developed just from the oil sands. That's a very unique situation up there that nowhere else has in the world. And they've developed technologies to be safer. They've been working on reclamation. And then on top of that, the technologies they've built have touched other areas of life: healthcare, transportation, renewable energies, infrastructure, manufacturing. These things need to be recognized, and I think you guys are on the right path of getting that messaging out there. And I like the ESG is starting to fall and be a more measurable item in a company's operations that everybody is looking at, and that's huge. That's super fantastic. I'll talk maybe one more thing on infrastructure. You guys have a lot of mandate towards infrastructure to making energy and clean energy reachable by many, and we talk about that not just here in Alberta and Canada, but even in other countries, developing countries that might not have the resources or the finances to refine their energy into something that's safe and accessible by all. Talk a little bit about how you guys are focusing on that as well, and what your communication is to countries that you're trying to help in the same breath just outside of Canada as well.
So thank you for that question. Alberta is already a leader in CCUS and hydrogen. And these are technologies that are expensive to research, expensive to incubate, expensive to develop, and they are going to be needed. They are absolutely necessary as the world travels towards 2050. But we have developing nations that are still building coal units, and their populations are growing, so they're still cutting down trees and so on and so forth because they have to. And so I think it's incumbent on the first world, and particularly those of us in the first world, like the province of Alberta, who are particularly expert in this, to develop these things so that eventually we can help those developing nations reduce their carbon emissions as well. And we are on the way to that. And so, for example, we are developing in Alberta, and there are some projects in BC and in Texas as well, direct air capture, which would not, it doesn't need a point source for carbon. It can just be set down somewhere and take carbon straight out of the air. And so once we get that sort of technology working and economic here, we'll be able to send it to China, India, Africa, places that can't afford to spend their money on this sort of thing because they've got other priorities. We'll be able to help them with that. And I'm very proud of the fact that here in Alberta, we're developing these technologies that can help the whole world move towards 2050.
No kidding. That's fantastic. Right on. Kate, thank you so much for coming and talking to us today and giving us your insights into what Capital Power is doing and just kind of educating us on like how the world is beginning to work together. We need to keep it going and quote unquote put the pedal to the metal there, put it on the gas and make sure that we're continuing forward in this. I'm really excited to hear about these goals that you guys are working towards and are crushing on getting to them. And like you said, by 2030 we want to already have that technology that's in place that's going to help us get to the 2050. So again, you guys are doing a fantastic job. You're Alberta-based, super awesome to hear and see that that's coming out of here and that we're a leader in this on such an important topic and that things are getting done. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.